Welcome back to the deep dive. Sometimes I just can't resist a deep dive into the dark side of things.
Yeah,
So today,
they're fun.
we're tackling the art of always being right. That intriguing book by the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer.
Oh, yeah.
Get ready to uncover some sneaky tactics people use to win arguments, even if it means leaving truth and logic behind.
Well, what's really fascinating here is that this book, published way back in 1831, is still so incredibly relevant today.
Right.
It's like Schopenhauer had this uncanny ability to see right through the smoke and mirrors of human nature.
Okay, so before we get into these debatable strategies, let's paint a little picture of the man himself.
Sure.
Who was this Schopenhauer, and what made him so fascinated by these argumentation tactics?
Well, Arthur Schopenhauer was a German philosopher known for his, shall we say, rather dim view of the world.
Hmm.
He believed humans were driven by this relentless will, this constant striving and desire that often leads to conflict.
Oh.
So it makes sense that he'd be intrigued by how this will plays out in arguments,
Hmm.
particularly when winning becomes more important than truth.
So he wasn't exactly throwing a pep rally for humanity.
Not exactly, no.
That makes his interest in these underhanded tactics all the more intriguing. His book isn't exactly a guide to ethical debate, is it?
Not quite. It's more like he's pulling back the curtain on the darker side of human nature,
Okay.
revealing the tricks we use to get our way, even if it means bending the truth a bit. And he does it all with a touch of satire, which makes it both entertaining and insightful.
That's what I love about this kind of deep dive. It's like getting a glimpse into the secret playbook of manipulation.
Yeah.
So how does Schopenhauer organize this arsenal of argumentation tactics?
He breaks it down into 38 stratagems or tricks each one, a clever tool designed to give you the upper hand,
Okay.
regardless of the actual strength of your position. It's almost like a Machiavellian guide to verbal warfare.
Okay, this is starting to feel like required reading for politicians, and dare I say, those who like to stir the pot online. Give me an example. What's one of these sneaky stratagems that really jumped out at you?
One that's particularly relevant today is what Schopenhauer calls extension. Have you ever noticed how some people take their opponent's argument and just stretch it beyond all recognition?
Oh, all the time. It's like they
Uh,
take a tiny seed of an idea and blow it up into this giant, monstrous straw man
Yes,
just so they can easily knock it down.
exactly. That's extension in action.
Wow.
You take a specific point and broaden it, making it easier to attack. Imagine someone arguing for a modest tax increase to fund, say, public schools.
Right.
Someone using extension might accuse them of wanting to bankrupt the nation with taxes, completely ignoring the nuanced argument about funding priorities.
Wow. Yeah. It's like they're shifting the goalposts to a whole different playing field. And by doing that, they avoid actually addressing the original point, which is probably more difficult to refute. I'm starting to see how this could be incredibly effective, even if it's totally unfair. Have you ever noticed this tactic used in, like, political debates?
Oh, absolutely. Political debates are prime territory for extension. Think about any discussion on immigration policy.
Okay.
Someone proposing a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants might be accused of wanting open borders and a flood of uncontrolled migration, completely distorting their position.
Okay, yeah, that's a classic. It's amazing how a subtle shift in wording can completely derail a conversation. It makes you realize how important it is to really listen to what's being said and not get swept up in these rhetorical tricks.
It really highlights the power of language to shape our perceptions.
Yeah.
And that's precisely why Schopenhauer's work is so valuable.
Yeah.
He's giving us the tools to see through these verbal smokescreens.
Speaking of smoke screens, Schopenhauer also talks about the tactic of playing on words. Now, that sounds like a recipe for disaster in any conversation where you're actually trying to find common ground.
Playing on words is all about exploiting those slippery little ambiguities in language.
Hmm.
It's like a verbal sleight of hand, using double meanings or subtle shifts in definition to create confusion.
So it's like creating this fog of words where the original meaning gets lost. Can you give me a real-world example of this playing on words strategy in action?
Let's say you're discussing healthcare reform and someone advocates for patient choice. Sounds good, right?
Actually, she doesn't want choices.
But that seemingly positive phrase can mask a lot of complexity.
I see.
Does patient choice mean choosing any doctor or treatment regardless of cost?
Right.
Does it imply a reduction in regulations potentially affecting quality of care? The phrase itself is deliberately vague, allowing the speaker to avoid specifics and appeal to a general desire for autonomy.
It's almost like a magician's trick. You're so focused on the positive association with choice that you don't even notice the potential downsides being swept under the rug. Do you think this is a common tactic in advertising as well?
Oh, absolutely. Advertisers are masters of playing on words. They use words like natural, organic, or eco-friendly to evoke positive emotions, even if the product itself only barely meets those definitions. It's all about creating an illusion through language.
It's a fascinating and a little unnerving to see how easily we can be swayed by these linguistic tricks. It really highlights the need to be critical listeners and to always look beyond the surface of what's being said.
And sometimes these tactics can get even more, let's say, aggressive rhetoric. Schopenhauer doesn't shy away from the darker side of argumentation.
You're talking about stratagems like resorting to anger and personal attacks, right?
Mm.
It feels like we've all encountered that, whether it's in a heated political debate or just a disagreement with a friend.
Unfortunately, it's all too common.
Yeah.
The goal here is to provoke an emotional response to make your opponent lose their cool and appear irrational.
It's like that saying, never argue with a fool. They'll drag you down to their level and beat you with experience.
Right.
But in this case, the person using this tactic is deliberately trying to make their opponent look like the fool.
Exactly. By shifting the focus from the argument itself to the opponent's emotional state, they create a distraction and potentially discredit the other person's point of view.
So how might this play out in, let's say, an everyday disagreement? Can you give me a specific example?
Imagine you're having a family discussion about where to go on vacation.
Okay.
Someone suggests a relaxing beach trip, and someone using this stratagem might respond with, "Oh, so you just want to sit around and be lazy all week." It's a personal jab, completely irrelevant to the actual pros and cons of a beach vacation.
Ouch, that's got to sting. And it probably kills any chance of having a reasonable discussion about everyone's preferences.
Exactly. It's about shutting down the conversation, not contributing to it constructively. And sadly, this tactic is all too common on online forums and comment sections.
Oh, absolutely. It feels like anger and personal attacks are the default setting for some people online. It's like they're just looking for a fight, not a genuine exchange of ideas.
And that's the real danger of these tactics. They create a toxic environment where meaningful discussion becomes impossible. So it's essential to be aware of these strategies, not only to defend ourselves against them, but also to resist using them ourselves.
This is making me rethink every argument I've ever had. It's like you've given me a whole new lens through which to view these interactions, but knowing about these tactics is only half the battle, right? How can we actually use this knowledge to navigate tricky conversations more effectively?
That's a great question, and that's what we'll explore in part 2 of this deep dive. Stay tuned, because I think you'll find it really empowering.
All right, so we've delved into some of those shadowy stratagems that Schopenhauer laid out, and frankly, it's a bit unsettling to realize how common these tactics are.
Yeah.
But I'm feeling more aware, and that's a good start. Now, how do we actually use this knowledge to hold our own in those tricky conversations?
Well, awareness, as you said, is the crucial first step. When you can spot these tactics in real time, it's like having a shield against manipulation. It allows you to take a step back and think, hold on, is this person genuinely trying to have a productive discussion, or are they just pulling out all the stops to win?
It's like knowing the other player's moves in a chess match. You can anticipate their strategy and plan your counter moves. But recognizing these tactics is one thing. How do we actually respond when we see them being used?
That's where things get a bit more delicate. Directly accusing someone of using, let's say, a Schopenhauerian tactic might backfire. It could escalate the conflict, especially if there are other people involved.
It's like calling someone out for cheating in a game. It might be true, but it's not going to win you any points in the heat of the moment. So what's a more effective approach?
Instead of focusing on the tactic itself, try to steer the conversation back to the actual substance of the argument. Gently but firmly point out any logical fallacies, any ambiguous language, or any misrepresentations you notice.
So it's about staying calm, cool, and collected, even when the other person is trying to push your buttons.
Exactly. You want to maintain your composure and keep the focus on the facts. For instance, let's say someone tries to use extension to unfairly broaden your argument. You could calmly respond with something like, "My point was specifically about this particular aspect, not the much broader generalization you're suggesting."
Yeah.
You're essentially drawing a line in the sand saying, we're not going to play that game.
Ah. So it's about subtly but firmly pulling the conversation back on track, preventing it from getting derailed by the other person's tactics. We're not trying to win against their trickery. We're aiming for a more honest and productive exchange.
Precisely. Now let's talk about playing on words, because that's a tactic that can really make your head spin. How do we deal with that fog of ambiguity and those slippery shifts in meaning?
That's the one that really gets me. It's so sneaky because it often sounds reasonable on the surface, but then you realize the underlying meaning keeps shifting.
The best defense against playing on words is simply to ask clarifying questions. If a word or phrase seems vague or open to multiple interpretations, don't hesitate to politely ask for clarification. You might say something like, when you say fiscal responsibility, what specific policies are you referring to? Does that include cuts to social programs?
Ah, so it's about shining a light on those linguistic shadows, forcing the person to be more precise with their language. It's like saying, hold on, let's define our terms here before we go any further.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it also signals to anyone who might be listening that you're paying close attention and that you're committed to a clear, honest discussion. It can even create an opportunity for genuine understanding.
You mean even if you ultimately disagree with the other person, asking clarifying questions can help you understand where they're coming from?
Absolutely. By delving deeper into the meaning behind the words, you might uncover common ground or at least gain a better understanding of why you disagree.
Now let's talk about the one that's often the most difficult to handle, anger and personal attacks. It feels like that tactic is becoming more and more prevalent, especially in online discussions. How do we even begin to address those situations? I mean, it's hard not to get sucked into that negative energy.
It is tough, but it's essential to remember that the person resorting to anger and personal attacks is often driven by a desire to dominate, not to engage in a genuine exchange of ideas.
So if we react with anger, we're just playing right into their hand.
Exactly. It's like throwing fuel on a fire.
Well,
It only escalates the conflict and makes a productive conversation impossible.
easier said than done, right? Especially when someone is attacking your character or misrepresenting your views, it's hard not to take that personally.
It is, but the best course of action is often to refuse to engage on their level. If you're in an online forum, you might choose to simply disengage entirely. If it's a face-to-face conversation, you could calmly and firmly state that you're not willing to continue the discussion while personal attacks are being made.
So it's about setting boundaries and saying, look, I'm here to have a discussion based on reason and respect, not to engage in a shouting match.
Exactly. You have the power to choose how you participate in a conversation. You don't have to let someone else's manipulative tactics dictate the terms of engagement.
This is making me think about the whole concept of winning an argument. Maybe that's not even the right goal. Maybe there's a more constructive way to approach these disagreements.
That's a fantastic point, and it's something that Schopenhauer himself grappled with. While his book outlines these stratagems for always being right, he was deeply aware of the limitations of pure logic and reason. He understood that humans are driven by emotions, desires, and subconscious biases.
So he wasn't advocating for a world where everyone just coldly uses logic to outmaneuver each other.
Not at all. In fact, some argue that Schopenhauer's work is a critique of the very idea of using these tactics to dominate others. He saw it as a reflection of the inherent flaws in human nature.
That's a really interesting perspective. It suggests that maybe the most important thing isn't about winning at all. Maybe it's about striving for something deeper, like mutual understanding or genuine connection, even if we disagree.
Precisely. Which leads us to a really important question. If we recognize the limitations of argumentation and the potential for manipulation, can we move towards a more constructive and collaborative approach to dialogue?
That's a really big question and one that I think deserves its own deep dive.
I agree.
Maybe we'll save that for another time. But for now, it feels like we've only just scratched the surface of Schopenhauer's work and the complexities of argumentation.
We have,
Yeah.
but I think we've equipped you with some valuable tools to start recognizing those manipulative tactics and to engage in conversations more thoughtfully and effectively. Remember, knowledge is power, and by understanding the darker side of argumentation, we can all strive for a more honest and productive exchange of ideas.
Well said. So for our listeners who might be thinking, okay, this is all fascinating, but how do I actually apply this to my life? What are some key takeaways they can start using today?
First and foremost, stay aware. Pay attention to the language being used, the way the argument is being framed. Second, don't be afraid to ask for clarification. It's a powerful way to expose ambiguity and ensure everyone is on the same page. And finally, remember that disengaging is always an option. You don't have to participate in conversations that are disrespectful, manipulative, or unproductive.
That's great advice. And a reminder for our listeners, this is only part 2 of our 3-part deep dive into the art of always being. Right, we've got a lot more to explore, so stay tuned for our final part. All right, we've spent the last 2 parts of this deep dive exploring some pretty sneaky argumentation tactics. But, this whole conversation has me thinking, maybe the real issue isn't just the tactics themselves,
Right.
but the whole win-at-all-costs mindset behind them.
That's a really sharp observation.
Yeah.
Schopenhauer's The Art of Always Being Right really zeroes in on that idea of winning, even if it means sacrificing truth or genuine understanding.
Yeah.
It's like viewing every argument as this battle where only one side can come out on top.
It's like everyone's trying to climb to the top of the same mountain, but they're too busy shoving each other off the trail to enjoy the view. Doesn't exactly sound like a recipe for productive conversation, does it?
Not at all.
No?
It creates this adversarial atmosphere where everyone's focused on proving their point, defending their territory, and scoring points rather than actually listening and learning from each other.
Right.
It's exhausting.
I am exhausted just thinking about it.
Mm.
So, if the goal isn't about winning or crushing your opponent, what should we be aiming for instead? What's a healthier approach to disagreement?
What if instead of viewing an argument as a battle, we approached it as a shared journey of discovery? A chance to explore different perspectives, challenge our own assumptions, and maybe even arrive at a more nuanced understanding of the topic at hand.
I love that. It's like turning a boxing match into a dance. Instead of trying to knock each other out, we're
Yeah.
moving together, exploring different steps, and maybe even creating something beautiful in the process.
Exactly. It requires a real shift in mindset, though. It means entering the conversation with genuine curiosity, with a willingness to listen deeply to the other person's perspective, even if you disagree with it. It's about asking questions not to trap your opponent, but to truly understand where they're coming from.
So it's less about I'm right and you're wrong, and more about, hey, let's explore this together and see where we land. We might even surprise each other. I can see how that could lead to a much more productive and enjoyable exchange.
Absolutely. And it also involves being willing to acknowledge the limitations of your own perspective, recognizing that you don't have all the answers and that the other person might have something valuable to offer, even if you don't initially agree with them.
It's about embracing that humbling realization that none of us has a monopoly on truth. We're all just trying to make sense of this complex world, and we can learn so much from each other if we approach these conversations with an open mind and a willingness to be wrong.
Speaking of embracing humility, it reminds me of that famous quote from Socrates. The only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing.
Perfect. That willingness to admit we might be wrong is essential for genuine dialogue and growth. It creates space for real learning, for changing our minds, for expanding our perspectives.
And let's be honest, changing your mind based on new information or a compelling argument isn't a sign of weakness.
Right?
It's a sign of intellectual honesty and a commitment to growth. It shows you're prioritizing truth and understanding over the need to be right all the time.
It's like admitting you got lost on a road trip. You can stubbornly insist you're on the right path, or you can look at the map, adjust your course, and maybe even discover something amazing you wouldn't have found otherwise.
Exactly. But unfortunately, it seems like that kind of humility and openness is getting rarer, especially in those heated debates we see online. It's like everyone's dug into their trenches, and there's very little room for genuine dialogue or understanding.
It's the online battlefield. Everyone's armed with their talking points,
Yeah.
and they're ready to fire at will. It's no wonder those conversations so often devolve into shouting matches and personal attacks.
The speed and anonymity of online interactions can definitely make it easier to resort to those Schopenhauerian tactics. It's like the internet provides the perfect breeding ground for negativity and manipulation. But that doesn't mean we have to give in to it.
So how do we bring this more collaborative, open-minded spirit into those digital spaces? Is it even possible?
It might seem daunting, but I believe it starts with each of us making a conscious choice to engage differently,
Okay.
to resist the temptation to score points, to use inflammatory language, or to dismiss opposing viewpoints without truly considering them.
It's like being that one person who refuses to play the blame game at a family gathering.
Yes.
You might feel awkward at first, but it can create a ripple effect and inspire others to step back from the conflict as well.
Exactly. And even in those anonymous online spaces, our choices matter. Every time we choose to engage thoughtfully, to listen with empathy, and to seek understanding rather than victory, we contribute to a more constructive online culture. It might seem like a drop in the ocean, but those drops can eventually create waves.
I love that image. It's a reminder that even small acts of kindness and mindful engagement can have a positive impact. And who knows, maybe those acts will inspire others to do the same, creating a ripple effect that spreads far and wide.
That's the hope, isn't it? That by understanding the darker side of argumentation and consciously choosing a different path, we can create spaces for more meaningful and productive dialogues, both online and offline.
So if you're listening to this and thinking, okay, this is all inspiring, but where do I even begin? What's a practical first step you can take today?
I think the most important thing is to be mindful of your own intentions when entering a discussion.
Okay.
Ask yourself, what am I hoping to achieve here? Am I truly open to learning and understanding, or am I just trying to prove a point? If
Ah,
you find yourself primarily focused on winning or proving your superiority, it might be time to reevaluate your approach.
That's a great point, and it's a good reminder to keep those Schopenhauerian tactics in mind, not just to recognize them in others, but also to catch ourselves when we might be tempted to use them.
it's exactly. Self-awareness is key. And remember, it's okay to disagree.
Yeah.
Disagreement can be a valuable source of growth and insight as long as it's approached with respect, curiosity, and a willingness to see beyond our own limited perspectives.
This has been such a thought-provoking deep dive. It feels like we've gone beyond those surface-level tactics and into a deeper reflection on the nature of communication and what it truly means to connect with each other even when we disagree.
It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope it encourages our listeners to view every conversation as
Right.
an opportunity to connect, to learn, and to expand our understanding of the world and each other. Let's choose to make the most of those opportunities and to engage in a way that honors the complexity and beauty of the human experience.
Beautifully said. And with that, we'll wrap up our deep dive into Arthur Schopenhauer's The Art of Always Being Right. Thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive